Hey, what's up, everybody? Marquis Munson here. Welcome to my session. This is podcasting. So I know you guys have a lot of free time on your hands now due to the pandemic, and you may want to get some ideas flowing through your head. And one of those ideas can be podcasting. So thank you for joining this session. I'll be teaching you a little bit about podcasting, kind of coming up with different ideas on, topics and equipment. All that will be answered within this 30 minutes or less. So thank you guys for tuning in. Now, a little bit of background on me. First of all, I love Kobe Bryant and I love Alabama, as you can tell from the two things that you see in my background. But a little bit of background on me. My name is Marquis Munson. I am from California originally, and then I moved to Tuscaloosa, Alabama when I was 13 years old. So when I started high school, I moved to the University of Alabama City, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where I went to Paul W. Bryan High School. Once I graduated from there, I went to community college at Shelton State. That's when I kind of started to get into broadcasting a little bit. I was doing high school football games. I was also doing Shelton State Community College basketball and women's basketball games as well. I was doing play-by-play for those. So that's kind of how I got my start in media. But then once I got to the University of Alabama, I kind of hit the ground running. I started off on the student radio station, and then I was, doing a show from 12 a.m. to like 3, just because I wanted to talk basketball, just because I wanted to talk about Kobe stats all night. I would do a show from midnight to 3 a.m., and that's kind of how I got into sports radio. And then, once I graduated, I started working at Tide 100.9, which is the local station out there in Tuscaloosa, covering Alabama football. And then now I'm here in Nashville, and I'm living the good life in Nashville, working at ESPN 102.5 The Game here, and I produce the midday show here. So I have a lot of experience in radio, but as I go along through this session, you'll kind of see that everything's kind of parallel when it comes to radio and podcasting. So, and I've also hosted a few podcasts as well. My very first podcast, I try to do on my own, where I just wanted to sit down and just talk basketball. And I realized that doing a podcast by yourself is kind of hard. You feel like you're talking to yourself, kind of like how I am right now. Like, I don't see the students, but I still feel like I'm talking to myself. That's kind of how a podcast feels, where if you do it by yourself, it feels like you're talking to yourself. And that's one problem that I had starting off. I was like, man, look, I cannot be sitting here talking to myself. We're going to have to get some conversation flowing. And, that's to me what makes a good podcast is conversation. Every podcast that I listen to is never usually a one-man show. And if it is a one-man show, then they usually have a guest on their whole entire podcast where they're talking about different topics and different issues. And that's one thing I didn't think about when I first started a podcast. I was just like, look, I like basketball. I want to talk basketball. So let me go talk basketball on this podcast. And then it sounded funny because it was just like, so Marquis, what were your thoughts on that? Yeah, I thought those thoughts were pretty good. So I avoided doing the podcast by myself. And then I got into doing podcasts with my friend who's also named Mark. So we did a Mark and Mark podcast, kind of like Mike and Mike, but we put our own little swag and little flavor to it. So it was the Mark and Mark podcast. And then I was also doing the Alabama basketball podcast because I was covering Alabama basketball at the time. Me and my digital managing editor, Ben George, who I worked with at Tide 100.9, we put this podcast together. We would talk everything college basketball related, but obviously since it's called the Alabama Basketball Podcast, that's kind of what we focused on. But we shift our gears into different directions. And, so basically to kind of start this off, I want to say that, coming up with an idea is very important, because you have to think about how many podcasts there are. Like, as much as I love the Lakers, I'm pretty sure there's, 80 different Laker podcasts that you can listen to. So when you come up with these ideas of, I want to do a Alabama football podcast, or I want to do a, LA Dodgers podcast. Sorry, I'm naming a bunch of teams that I like, but, when you have those ideas of I want to cover this or I want to do a baseball podcast, you have to figure out what's unique about your own podcast. Because when you listen, to everybody else's podcast, you don't want to just be like, oh, it's just another ordinary baseball podcast. You got to figure out what separates yourself from everybody else's podcast. What do you offer in your podcast that's so unique that everybody else is drawn to what you have to say about baseball rather than what the other person has to say? A lot of times it has to do with personality. Have to have great personality, obviously, but a lot of it has to do with the content that you produce and, what you talk about on your podcast. So, if we're doing an Alabama basketball podcast, just finding different and unique ways to talk about Alabama basketball in a way that is not being talked about from everybody else. So that's kind of the most difficult thing, because you got to think, there's so many podcasts out there. Everybody has a podcast about something: cooking, movie reviews, music, sports, every different topic. There's always a podcast for it. I'm pretty sure if you wanted to learn how to fix your car, whoever's driving, because I know you guys are high school kids, so whoever's driving at this point, if you wanted to listen to a podcast on how to drive cars or how to drive a car, how to fix a car, there's probably something for that. So you have to figure out what's different and what's more unique about yours. A lot of times when, I started my podcast, I would listen to other people's podcasts just to see how I can, be different from everybody else. One person in particular that I would listen to is a guy by the name of Zach Lowe. He has the Low Post podcast that's on ESPN. All his basketball analysis is a lot different than any other analysis that I can hear from any other basketball person that I've ever heard. So that's what kind of drew me to his podcast, is just his uniqueness of how he broke down the game. It wasn't the typical game box that you would see on ESPN. Like, he would really break the game down and really dissect it. And that's kind of what made him more unique to me than any other podcast that I would listen to when it came to basketball. So you have to figure out what makes yourself different. It's not only just your personality, because obviously personality is going to differ from different person. My personality is probably different from a lot of other people's personalities that you've heard, doing these videos today. So, you have to figure out how you're going to shift it, how you're going to introduce your own little swag to it. So that's kind of the first step of getting your whole podcast going, is just coming up with an idea and brainstorming ideas. Especially Zach Lowe does that podcast by himself, but he also has people on the podcast that helps him and that talks with him. So that's why it's always good to collaborate with people that you have a chemistry with, that you can sit here and have a conversation with on a normal day-to-day basis. I was always taught that, and sports radio is kind of parallel to this, I was always taught that picture, and hopefully you guys won't have to worry about this until you're 21, but picture being in a bar or being somewhere with your friends and you guys are talking sports. That's kind of how sports radio is. It's kind of how podcasts are. You have these daily conversations with your friends all day, every day, about issues going on in school, the latest gossip that's going on, whatever, with the Kardashians. Just coming up with something, off the top of my head. But just having these different conversations, whether it's gossip, whether it's news, or whatever it is, whether it's politics, you always have these conversations. So just imagine if those conversations are just being recorded and for the masses. Like, maybe other people share those same opinions that you have on this conversation, and you're just sharing it with the masses. And that's really the basic of what podcasts are. So it's general conversation. And that's the best podcast. I don't want to sit here, and you guys don't want to sit here and have somebody read to you. Because guess what? You can read yourself. Like, I don't need somebody, on a podcast to read me stats or to, read the latest news on the NBA. I want opinion. I want their opinion, and I want their personality with the addition of that opinion. So that's what you have to find in your own podcast. It's just your own voice, your own opinion. And whether that's what people agree with or disagree with, never hold back to this is my opinion. And because you're going to get an audience that loves it, and you're going to probably get some people that don't like it. And that's fine, because it's different perspective. Because guess what? There's probably a podcast that's way different than your podcast. There's political podcasts that are one way and then another way, and both of them are different perspectives. And that's what you want to be able to offer in your podcast, just a different perspective. So now it's kind of the setup process and the equipment. I always get asked, I want to do a podcast, but I don't know what to use as far as equipment is concerned. I don't have equipment with me today, but all you really need is two things for just a generic podcast. That is a software, an audio software that you can have, whether that's Adobe Audition, whether that's Cool Edit. There's different voice recording audio software that you can find that's what you need. And as far as a microphone's concerned, get you a good microphone. You can be able to hear clearly. My first podcast I ever did, I bought this cheap microphone for probably, I'll say $20. It's a $20 microphone. But I thought, I was like, okay, I'm in. I got the microphone. I'm good to go. That microphone was awful. I had to record in my closet the first 2 episodes, and it still sounded just awful. So sometimes it's a little costly when it comes to buying your own equipment, but trust me, a lot of times it's worth it. A good microphone is going to cost you between $50 to $100 just for a good microphone to make you sound like this is the most professional thing I've ever heard. And that's what you want. You don't want it to sound, because if it sounds all goggy and you can barely hear, you hear your air conditioning in the background because that's background noise, then people aren't going to listen to it. The first 2 minutes, people are just going to be like, I'm done. This guy or girl has awful audio. Let's move on. So you want to make sure you have the right equipment, and all that is like, you really don't need the soundboard. Like, there's podcast setups that are just way out of the realm to where they try to make it sound professional as possible, and that's perfectly fine. If you want to get a soundboard, if you want to get these different things, that's perfectly fine. But just for a generic podcast, I just want to make it sound good. All you need is basically a microphone and audio software, and you can download that anywhere. You can download Adobe Audition anywhere. You can download Cool Edit. You can download that anywhere. A lot of times it's free, sometimes it's not. So, that's the basis of kind of getting your podcast recorded. And you're putting what I said earlier about your topic and your ideas, putting that together with this audio software that you buy, and you're just putting everything to paper and just lining it up that way. So, because I think the hardest thing for me is just creating content, especially now. I have no sports. It's hard to talk sports. I do a 4-hour radio show. It's hard to do 4 hours of radio when you have no sports. So it's always finding different and unique ways on talking about sports and talking about anything in general, cooking. Like, there's a podcast and there's a niche for everybody. And I think you have to find your niche. Like, my niche is sports. I would love to do one day, like an old school hip hop podcast, because I love old school hip hop. I'm a huge hip hop head. So hopefully one day I can do that. If it's politics, there's a lot going on in the world right now. And if you feel like you're young, you guys are probably 15, 16, 17 years old. You guys want to share your young voices to other young voices. That's a perfect niche to have that audience. That niche is that audience that you're getting. I'm doing a sports podcast. I'm probably doing a sports podcast for, guess what? People who like sports. If I'm doing a cooking podcast, which I can't cook, but if I'm doing a cooking podcast, guess who I'm doing that for? People who can cook. People who wants to, want to learn to cook. So finding that audience, and you guys having young voices, that's an audience alone. I can't speak for a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old. I can speak for the 28-year-olds and the 29 and 30-year-olds because that's my age range, but you know, you can speak for the masses of your young generation. If you want to do a podcast with all this political stuff going on, I would love to hear a podcast from the new generation, from like someone younger than me, just from their perspective on how the generation's getting moved forward. So that's an audience right there. It's just creating your audience and finding an audience. As I'm at the 15-minute mark, and that's when I said I was going to take a drink. But it's a good drink. But that's kind of what you want to aim for, is to aim for that audience. And you know, whether there's a lot of different, like, I like crime shows. So I listen to a podcast called Crime in Sports, which I don't suggest until you're 18 to actually listen to that podcast, because it's, you know, it's got a lot of language in it. But it's a great podcast when it comes to talking about crime in sports, which add two things that I love. I love watching crime shows and like Law and Order, and I love sports. So you add that together, that is just a mashup of two things that I just absolutely love. And that's kind of what you're doing with your podcast. It's just finding different things and getting unique voices on, you know, not just being your perspective, you know, having different voices, different perspectives. You know, I am a young African-American male. If I'm going to do a podcast on the current issues that are going on in the world, I would love to get someone of the opposite of me so we can sit here and have a constructive conversation, because that's what makes great content, is constructive conversation. You know, I know you guys are used to watching, you know, ESPN First Take, and it's all yelling at each other and over talking and overstepping each other. Some of the best podcasts are just conversations and being able to listen to people with different perspectives, maybe from you or the same perspective as you, but with a different mindset going into it. Those are the best ones. And those are the ones that you want to create. And, you know, those are the ones you want to put out to the masses. So it's coming up with those ideas, and it's getting the equipment. Those are the main two things that I kind of touched on in the first 17 minutes of this video. And I put heavy emphasis on those two because those two things are very important. But there's one more thing to me that is very important, and that is marketing. And that is where to put your podcast. You know, it all depends on, you know, you want to make your podcast accessible. You want to make sure that it's not hard to find. You know, if you put it somewhere where it's like, it's on my like WordPress page, or it's on this place that I cannot find, this website that I cannot find, you want to make it accessible for everybody. That's not, you know, okay, so I have an iPhone, so I'm going to only put my podcast on Apple Podcasts. Like, no, you want to put your podcast on Apple and Spotify, just in case there's not a lot of people who have iPhones. So you want to make sure you put it in different avenues so they can have access to your podcast. We podcast our shows every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Every day we're podcasting our shows, our interviews, everything. And we always put them on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, anywhere you can get podcasts. You want to make sure that they have access to that. And the main ones that usually a lot of people use to upload podcasts a lot of times are SoundCloud and Audio Boom. Audio Boom is a little bit easier because Audio Boom, you can basically put your podcast on there. You can upload all your audio for your podcast, put it on there, and then all of a sudden you can have it on different avenues. So you can have it on, it automatically adds it on Apple Music or Apple Podcasts. It automatically adds it to Spotify, automatically adds it to Google Play. So with SoundCloud, it's a little harder because SoundCloud, you have to do a bunch of different other stuff that it's very hard to explain. Like you have to get like an RSS feed that you have to transfer over to Apple, and then Apple has to approve it. And then that's how you kind of add your podcast. Like Audio Boom to me is the best source to add your podcast. Because as soon as you upload that audio is on Apple, it's on Spotify, it's everywhere. So you don't have to like add this RSS feed everywhere for you to have access to that podcast. So because you want to make it accessible. You want to make sure that it's easy for people to get. You know, not just people who have iPhones, people with, Androids too. I know you guys hate to see those green bubbles pop up on your phone, but guess what? They do exist in this world. So we have to make sure we cater to those people as well when it comes to the podcast. And Google Play is more so an Android thing. Like a lot of people who listen to podcasts on their Android listen to Google Play. So you want to make sure that it gets on Google Play. So I think SoundCloud's a little easier to upload. I think it's a little bit easier to, kind of figure things out on SoundCloud, but Audio Boom is the perfect website to try to add your podcast on there. And then I'm going to have a whole outline of just steps and different things that I've talked about on this on an outline, so you don't have to, scroll back to the 20th minute marker of this video to be like, I wonder what he said, which avenue I should add this podcast to. So I'll make sure to have an outline for you guys so you guys can look at that as well to kind of do that. But I mean, that's pretty much the basis of podcasts. Like my goal is to create, I always want to do and I'm going to say this idea, and this is copyrighted now. As of today, this is copyrighted. Always wanted to do a podcast where I go back to old games that I used to watch back in the day and just do commentary on them and just kind of talk about those games as I'm watching them. Like I was watching the 2001 NBA Finals a few weeks ago, where it was Allen Iverson's game against the Lakers, and Allen Iverson, scored over 43 points. He stepped over Tyronn Lue. That's what that game is infamous for. I want to go back and do that. Because there's a wrestling podcast that I love to listen to that do that. They go back to old wrestling shows and they just kind of break them down and talk about them. And so the ideas like that, you don't want your podcast to just be okay, so the latest news, David Price is not playing for the Dodgers. What does that mean for the Dodgers? Guess what? There's going to be 800 people talking about that same topic possibly. So you want to be able to separate yourself from everybody else. Separate yourself from the pack. So coming up with unique ideas like that. If you and your friends have this this thing, this TV show, for example. There's podcasts on TV shows. There's a podcast, and I hate to say this because I don't like this show. There's a podcast on The Bachelor, and it's awful. To me, it's not awful as far as a podcast because it's pretty well done, pretty well put together as far as music and conversation. But I don't like The Bachelor, and I don't like The Bachelorette, and I don't listen to that stuff. But guess what? There's a podcast for it if you do, because I know there's a lot of people who like that stuff, and so they're able to listen to it. And so whatever it is, if your friends like Stranger Things and you guys want to just talk about it, have an opinion on it, that's fine. There's one of my favorite shows that I got to watch during the quarantine was The Wire. And it was an old show on HBO. And Jamel Hill, who used to be on ESPN, has a podcast on The Wire. And I have not been able to listen to it yet, but they basically break down every episode of The Wire. And I need to just go ahead and catch up and listen to it. So that's one podcast that I listen to. It's just, I never listen to any generic sports podcasts. Those to me are just, I can listen to sports radio if I want to do that. So I normally just listen to something that unique and that catches my eye. But to basically recap everything that I've talked about in these 23 minutes, because I know I've been talking pretty fast, basically come up with a creative idea. That is step number one, is coming up with a unique idea, coming up with people that you have chemistry with, that have the same knowledge of this topic that you want to talk about, getting together with those people and creating something special. Because some of my best podcasts have been with people that I've had chemistry with and that I have a friendship with, and it shows, and you can hear it. I don't want to, I can tell when you guys are genuine about the topic that you're talking about, because there's so much passion in your voice when you talk about it. So making sure you come up with that topic and that idea, and then maybe brainstorming who to do this podcast with, and who to create this podcast with, and coming up with different ideas and creative ideas on different episodes, because it's hard, especially when you're doing a podcast. I don't know how Jamel Hill does it, because you're basically just doing a podcast on episodes of The Wire. So once, the episodes of The Wire are over, what do you do after that? So it's always just trying to find different ways to spin things and different topics and different ideas. And, that's step number one. That's the main step that you have to make, is coming up with that creativity that's different from everybody else's podcast. Second is obviously the equipment, because you need equipment to record it. So whether that's and there's a lot of these too. There's a lot of video podcasts. This is technically a video podcast, and I'm talking to myself. This is technically a video podcast where I'm talking to you, or I'm talking to whoever's watching this. So there's video podcasts where it's video and it's audio, and people can see you and see your reactions and see your facial expressions. But getting that equipment, whether that's a microphone and the audio software, and like I said, make it accessible for everybody. But one more point before I let you guys go is market yourself, because when people listen to podcasts, they listen to personality. A lot of times they listen to the topic, but a lot of times it also goes with who's talking about that topic. I love, let's say LeBron James. I love LeBron James, but I do not want to hear a podcast of LeBron James talking about baseball. Like, I just don't. Because I'm pretty sure he doesn't know more than what a Tim Kurchin or somebody who covers baseball knows about that. So I'd rather hear LeBron talk about basketball than to talk about, baseball. So it's all about marketing yourself, being able to showcase your personality on different platforms, whether that's Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I don't use TikTok. That's the avenue I don't use. But Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever you want to use to kind of put yourself out there and make sure people know who you are as you're coming up with this podcast and as you're recording this podcast, because it draws people. I listen to Bill Simmons' podcast. I listen to Zach Lowe. There's a podcast on sports media by Richard Deitch that I listen to. There's different podcasts. And notice I named the names of people. Jamel Hill, Van Lathan. I listen to those podcasts. And I know because I know those people. I'm comfortable with those people. I can listen to those people talk because I've watched them on TV. I've heard them talk. I'm comfortable with them. I see them on social media. So, have a strong social media presence, because that's a big thing when you're creating this personality that, and showing people who you are as far as a radio broadcaster or a podcaster, being able to, have fun and have fun with your listeners and, be able to engage with people who listen to your podcast. So that's one of another main thing that, I want to tell you guys is to market yourself and, be out there on social media, sell your podcast to everybody in the masses that, wants to listen to it. So those are pretty much the basics. I'll have all this written down in an outline for you guys can, take home with you and maybe gather some ideas. Maybe you get together with your friends and maybe you guys can think about, after watching this video of hey guys, maybe it'd be cool if we do a podcast and, and create something special. And if you ever need any advice, my information is on this program as well. My email is on this program. My Twitter is on this program. My Twitter is wide open. DMs be open. Just don't say anything crazy in my DMs, because I will screenshot you and I'll probably call you out and have a good laugh about it. I'm just kidding. I won't do that. But DM me, email me, anything you guys need as far as, more information. This thing is weird, because usually when I teach these classes, I talk for maybe about 10 minutes and I answer questions for the remainder of the time, for the remaining 20 minutes. Usually these things are about an hour. And for the first 10 minutes, I'll talk about myself and I'll give you guys the basic information, what you guys, what I basically did on this video. So usually I get questions thrown at me, but if there's questions that you guys have, if there's comments that you guys have, just let me know. My email will be on this program, marquismunson16@gmail.com. My Twitter is Marquis Munson, MarquisMunson. So give me a follow, DM me, send me a message, whatever it is. I'm more than willing to help. I'll be teaching another session about how to live in a big city. So stay tuned for that. That's coming up later this week. So be tuned into that as well. Create your podcast, enjoy yourself, come up with creative ideas. You guys are young. You guys are the future of all of this media stuff. I'm an old pup. I got gray hairs now. I can see in the camera that I'm having gray hairs now, and I'm about to be 30. So, you guys are the next generation. You guys are the future of this media business and this media company. So a lot of these ideas are going to come from your brains and from your intelligence. And there's going to be things that you can teach some of us old pups like me. So, come up with some creative ideas, and I'm looking forward to seeing them. If you got a podcast already and you're watching this, go ahead and send them to me. I'll be more than willing to critique it as well. But thank you guys for watching this. Meredith, hi, how you doing? I know she's gonna watch all of this, so I just want to give her a big wave. Savannah, how you doing? But thank you guys for watching this, and appreciate it, and enjoy your sessions today. I'm Marquis Munson. For me and the Black Mamba, peace out.